How to be a winner, coach yourself to success, fulfill your potential. Yes, you can achieve your dreams. These are all titles of popular self-help books and arguably mantras of our era, while the self-loathing grumble that I just don't feel I've achieved anything with my life has become an increasingly common refrain on the sofas of both loved ones and therapists. The language of success and failure, it seems, is everywhere around us. Now, I imagine that most of us here, most of the people that we know, probably want to be a success or an achiever in some sense of the word. That might be academically, it might be musically, or in terms of sport. It might be about becoming a really good dad or being the best possible big sister. We often want to date people with ambition and goals, not some loser who's not going anywhere. And we want our future children to achieve as much as they can. These are ideas that feel very familiar to us. And they're not just concerns for us here in the UK. Nation-states around the world are racing to make their populations globally competitive, to attract international investment in their knowledge industries, so that ever more human beings are being told how important it is to be motivated, hard-working, and ultimately successful. But is this elusive category that we refer to as achievement really our ticket to prosperity and well-being? That is the question that I want to explore today. Well, obviously, sometimes it can be. I'm not going to stand here and pretend that it wouldn't be amazing to win the X Factor or the Olympics or something like that. It would be great. But if we zoom out a bit and we look at the bigger picture, things start to get a little bit more complicated. Because doing well is not always everything that it's cracked up to be. But why not? Now, at first glance, that might not appear to be a particularly anthropological question. It seems a philosophical question, or maybe a psychological question. But I'm hoping that over the course of the next half hour, I'm going to be able to show you how it is an anthropological question, giving you a flavour of some of the really important work that social anthropologists are doing to try and improve levels of mental health and quality of life and subjective well-being in societies around the world. And hopefully that will also give you all a taste of what anthropology is all about and whether or not it might be a subject that's of interest to you. So our story begins in New York, the quintessential city of achievement. When Frank Sinatra sang that if he could make it there, he'd make it anywhere, he did so to the swaggering sound of a full brass band. His lyrics told us that achieving pointed to an innate capacity of the self, one that he could use to make it anywhere. And the trumpets told us that was going to feel fantastic. But some little town blues don't melt away so easily. When the American playwright Tennessee Williams, who'd striven for years to make it as a stage success, finally won critical acclaim for his play The Glass Menagerie, he quickly fell into a terrible despair. He described himself as suffering a sense of spiritual dislocation. He became sick at the sight of his Manhattan hotel room. He felt so removed from the world that he could no longer taste the difference between the gravy and the chocolate sauce on his room service tray. A well of cynicism rose in me, he wrote. Conversations all sounded like they'd been recorded years ago and were being played back on a turntable. Sincerity and kindliness seemed to have gone out of my friends' voices. I suspected them of hypocrisy. I stopped calling them, stopped seeing them. And Williams later described this experience as the catastrophe of success. So how can we understand such an extreme negative reaction to what ought to have been a happy development? Well, one line of explanation, which I would describe as a biomedical approach, would focus on Williams as an individual. And certainly, if we look at his case with current medical knowledge in mind, then his symptoms, the forms of extreme social withdrawal he exhibited, his paranoia, even his sensorial disengagement with the sights and flavours of the world, would all seem to be hallmarks of a clinical depression. So we could very easily argue that this reflected a particular depressive episode, underpinned by an imbalance in his brain chemistry. We might even go further and speculate that there was some aspect of his psychological development, perhaps an inherited set of genes that he had, that rendered him particularly susceptible to depressive episodes. And those kinds of interpretations of the catastrophe of success would not be wrong. So I don't want to suggest in any way that all the important work that biologists and psychologists are doing into these more chemical aspects and developmental aspects of mental illness are anything other than extremely worthwhile. But I do think there are some aspects of the case that they simply can't explain. Because even if Williams was genetically predisposed to depression, let's say, why should it have been the fact that his play did well that served as the trigger for his breakdown? And that question becomes all the more important when we consider that experiencing a depressive episode in the wake of a big success is actually quite a common occurrence, not just in America, but also in Europe and in other parts of the world as well. So might it be that there's something intrinsic to success that gives it a high likelihood of triggering mental anguish? Well, possibly, but it's not something that we can understand properly without a thorough inquiry into what success means to the people who experience it in a given place at a particular time. Because it's because of that meaning, which is ultimately a sociocultural phenomenon, that the condition develops. So we need to add a sociocultural perspective to a biomedical approach if we want to fully understand what we're dealing with in cases like that of Tennessee Williams. And that's one important contribution that an anthropological approach, which is often highly focused on questions of cultural meaning, can provide. But there's also another contribution that anthropology can make. Because when you first hear of someone wanting to pull away from others and shut down, growing tired of the things they always used to enjoy, it seems like such a classic case of depression that the diagnosis seems pretty straightforward. But are we at risk of imposing our own categories of mental illness onto another time and place? We might be, because at the time, it was the 1940s, Williams was not diagnosed with depression, but with a disease called neurasthenia. Now, this is a condition which no longer exists in Western psychiatry, but at the time, in fact, for all of the first half of the 20th century, it was so common, so well known, that the term was as widely known as the word bicycle. So in other words, it was about as commonly known as words like depression and stress and anxiety are for us today. So this in itself raises some interesting questions. What happened to it? Why did it disappear? Did we just discover that neurasthenia was depression all along? Or could it be that neurasthenia and depression are actually two different, albeit similar, disorders, each specific to a particular time period and to a particular place? And if that's the case, then what is it about the world that we live in now that's causing depression to be on the rise and neurasthenia to have vanished? Now, those aren't questions that can be answered by biomedical perspectives alone either. They ask us to explore how the biochemical, anatomical elements of our brains interface with the social, cultural, historical world that those brains are constantly engaging with. And anthropology, as a discipline that's fundamentally concerned with all aspects of human being and how humans live in the world, can offer some really helpful perspectives for thinking about these difficult issues. And that's what I hope to share with you now. So putting the issue of success as a trigger to one side for the moment, the fundamental question that I think we have to deal with first is whether categories of mental illness exist universally, afflicting all human beings everywhere, or whether they vary cross-culturally, reflecting the fact that different societies have different concepts of the self, of the emotions, and of the mind. Now, as you might imagine, this has been a subject of tremendous debate. You could go to university and do a whole course just on this issue. But the current consensus generally goes something like this. It seems that in all societies, people can suffer debilitating feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and dissatisfaction with the things of the world, including with their social relationships. So that very general kind of experience does seem to be universal, and because it's debilitating, I think it's reasonable for us to say that it's a cross-culturally universal disorder. And the name that scholars have come to give to those feelings is dysphoria. So a capacity for dysphoria, it seems, is something that all human societies and all human beings share. However, there can be tremendous variation in how that dysphoria is expressed, described, and experienced. And here it seems that culture and history play a very large role. So, for example, in the West, we have a condition known as depression. And that's typically associated with a very particular cluster of symptoms. One feels, well, depressed, pushed down on, suffocated, lacking in energy and motivation, low. And those are ideas that have slipped into popular parlance. If you say, oh, I'm feeling a bit depressed today, we all know it's a reference to mood, energy levels, feelings. But elsewhere, different symptoms stand out. So in parts of West Africa, sufferers of dysphoria commonly describe their condition in terms of physical symptoms, a sense that ants are crawling around in their brain, or that someone has put pepper inside their head. In Mexico, dysphoria is described as a sensation that the brain is exploding. Now, these aren't especially common ways of reporting dysphoria in the UK or the USA. In fact, the idea of there being ants in the brain is usually something that a Western psychiatrist would associate with psychosis or a delusional disorder rather than a mood disorder like depression. So it led to a lot of incorrect diagnoses until this finding was reported. So what we're seeing is that even if biomedically the same kind of chemical imbalance is affecting the body in all of these different places, the actually experienced illness is quite different, or at least it's attended to differently. For example, in the UK, a lot of depressed people also suffer from headaches, actually, but those headaches don't become a prominent part of the way in which they relate to their suffering, or the way in which our society imagines the classic features of depression as a mental illness. So that raises the question of what it is about contemporary Western societies that makes the concept of depression as we know it such a compelling way of articulating the dysphoria that human beings anywhere and everywhere are prone to suffer. Why did depression only really take off as a recognized disorder in the second half of the 20th century? And why was the concept of neurasthenia so much more popular beforehand? And grappling with those questions will help us think a little bit more about the issue of success that I was talking about earlier. So to answer them, let's take a closer look at some of the differences between neurasthenia and depression. Now, neurasthenia, often described as a disease of the nerves, from which we get the term nervous breakdown, did include feelings of sadness and fatigue amongst its symptoms, but they weren't prioritized, they weren't the standout symptom. Equally, if not more important, were feelings of anxiety, and in particular neuralgia, or nerve pain. Now, interestingly, that nerve pain might not be so very different from the feeling of having ants or pepper inside the head that was being reported in West Africa. In fact, Tennessee Williams himself described his struggle with neurasthenia as like having wild cats under his skin. So physical pain, anxious feelings, and a sense of low mood all combined equally in the condition of neurasthenia. What changed in the transition to depression was that those feelings of low mood, fatigue, and social withdrawal came to take center stage, both in how doctors imagined mental illness in the public imagination of mental illness, and in the symptoms that patients themselves reported. So what could have led to such a shift? Well, I think there are two big factors that are particularly relevant for understanding what's going on here. Both involve a tremendous change in the experience of individualism, and therefore also in notions of the self that have been present in Western societies over the past 100 years. And that's because early 20th century life in Europe and America was far more regulated than is the case today. And there are two ways in which that can be said to be the case. At the level of politics and economics, the early 20th century was dominated by a Fordist mode of production. Workers were guaranteed a job for life. They had fixed regular hours and they had a steady income. And all of that was ensured by heavy state regulation of the markets under a Keynesian model. But in the late 20th century, under what's often called the neoliberal model of capitalism, the state has retreated, allowing the free market to regulate itself. Now, the result is that the operations of capitalism have become much more flexible, but also much more uncertain. People now work increasingly on short-term, temporary contracts. Factories might hop around from Mexico to Malaysia to Ethiopia, wherever's best for keeping the company's costs down. Individuals and governments have to work hard in order to prove their own employability, to keep that contract, to get it renewed, to attract investment capital. And that's precisely one of the reasons why, as I was saying earlier, there's so much emphasis today on trying to achieve and trying to be a success. If you don't, life can quickly become very difficult. And as the welfare state retreats and cedes power to the free market, it's increasingly our own responsibility to get that sorted out. So that was one factor, one form of big change that's taken place over the past 100 years. On the social and cultural side, we also see big changes. The attachments to family bonds, social norms, community values, religious values that were so widespread in the early 20th century started to receive serious challenges in the 1960s. The Summer of Love and the hippie counterculture movement overthrew long-standing taboos on sexuality, on communal living, on deference to authority, and so on. Feminist, gay rights, and civil rights movements challenged long-standing hierarchies of race, gender, and sexuality, all in the name of liberating individuals to really be themselves and express who they were. Now that's a positive development. I think most of us would agree. But crucially, whether we view it as positive or negative, in this domain, we also see a shift from regulation to responsibility. Because no longer regulated by social norms, instead, everyone has an increasing responsibility to be themselves as much as they possibly can. Now, I think these shifts in experiences of individuality and in notions of the self can help us understand why different aspects of dysphoria might now stand out as compelling to us versus those that stood out to our predecessors. So in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods and the early 20th century, when there were such strong emphases on social codes and social taboos, on obedience and conformity, when the experience of life was one of being acted upon and conforming to laws and norms, rather than being driven by one's own initiative, it made perfect sense that the feelings that would be most troublesome to people were feelings related to their guilt at actual or desired transgressions, of anxiety as to whether or not one ever would conform, or feelings of deep inner conflict. And so these were the kinds of distress that were often distilled into diagnostic labels like hysteria or neurasthenia. And it was these themes that lay at the heart of Freud's attempts to develop a psychoanalytic method of treatment. So it was these feelings of guilt and conflict that were the aspects of dysphoria that stood out to patient and clinician alike, because they resonated with a broader set of cultural concerns and anxieties. In contemporary times, though, slightly different themes take centre stage. transgression or the experience of your own personal desires isn't such a powerful source of anxiety or conflict in general, because it's what we're frequently encouraged to do, to be ourselves. But the trouble is that constantly having to be yourself takes a lot of effort. Constantly taking responsibility for your own self can be exhausting, and there's always more work to be done. There's always the risk that the life we live now is inadequate compared to the life that we could lead if only our potential was a little bit more fully realised. We can never get there. We're always falling short. And so I want to suggest it might not be the pressures of conformity, but rather the broader cultural concerns of responsibility that lie at the heart of much of our dysphoria today. Think of what marks depression out. The depressed person is someone who has trouble forming projects, who lacks energy, who lacks the minimum motivation to carry projects out. It's someone who stands in opposition to social norms of being this entrepreneurial, initiative-taking, self-driven individual. Faced, in other words, with the constant pressure to succeed, new forms of mental pathology have emerged. New culturally inflected expressions of the dysphoria that all human beings can experience. And at their core is the question of becoming a success and internal conflicts over whether one can manage it, whether one really wants to try. And of course, the high levels of work and low levels of leisure that tend to come along with neoliberal capitalist models also means that most people are so exhausted that if they do have any underlying predispositions necessary for a dysphoric episode, then it's all the more likely that it will be triggered because they just don't have the time to recover and maintain their mental well-being. So in this light, I think we can already see that the contemporary cultural emphases on success and achievement, on the ideals of the American dream, the self-made man, rags to riches, are not all that they're cracked up to be. Just by participating in that kind of culture, we risk ending up propagating the social norms and values that can actually be responsible for acute mental suffering, whether our own or that of others. And so that's one important insight for understanding mental illness and thinking about how we might be able to address the causes of contemporary mental illness rather than simply address the symptoms of the problem. Nevertheless, the argument which I've just put forward, which is largely inspired by a French sociologist called Alain Ehrenberg, and Catherine has the reference if you'd like to investigate further, still leaves us with several unanswered questions. Firstly, if depression is a disorder that reflects difficulty in fulfilling one's potential, then why should actually succeeding ever serve as a trigger for it? Doesn't seem to make sense. Secondly, the account that I've just given is really incredibly sweeping, as if everyone since the 1950s is experiencing exactly the same thing. It might capture a broad truth, but does it really do justice to the different experiences of people living in different socioeconomic groups, of different genders, of different races, let alone the experiences of people living in different parts of the world? Parts of the world where the injunction to achieve and succeed is now just as common as it is in Europe and America. And to answer those questions, we need to take a slightly different kind of approach. So rather than doing this kind of very big, grand comparative anthropology that I've just done, looking at general trends in the experience of the self, we now need to think about how these kinds of issues might play out within much more sharply delineated contexts, very specific groups. And one of the great strengths of anthropology as a discipline and as a research method is it has a commitment to long-term, intensive participant observation through ethnographic fieldwork. An anthropologist will go and live with a group of people, sharing in their lives as much as possible for months, for years, and hopefully through that we'll be able to get a really deep insight into the meanings and values and concerns that animate how they live. And so I'm going to close by turning to a couple of cases that are based on exactly that kind of intensive ethnographic fieldwork, and that can allow us to understand the variegated way in which the dilemmas of being responsible for oneself might be experienced, and can also help illuminate how and why success can sometimes be unexpectedly painful. So the first case is a study by the American anthropologist Cynthia Fordham, who you see below on the right. And she spent many years working in an American high school, which she calls Capital High, it's a pseudonym, based in Washington, DC. Now, Fordham argues that the way that black kids in US high schools mediate their own success is profoundly affected by the enduring legacies of slavery, ongoing racial conflict, and in fact, ongoing de facto segregation between black and non-black children within the school environment. So for high-achieving black kids, she argues, academic success is a form of warfare. It's warfare against the expectations of dominant white society, which expects black kids to do worse. So the kids conform with white standards as a form of resistance against those low expectations. But the problem is that in doing so, they also come to be at war with many of their black peers, who argue that to preserve black identity and retain a sense of humanness, you should just totally reject any kind of measure of achievement that is put forward by a white-run system. So we see here that there's a terrible irony, a terrible predicament. These high-achieving kids are trying to use their success as a means of demonstrating or reclaiming their humanness, showing that they're not the kind of people that ought to have ever been enslaved. They can equal or even outperform their white peers. But in doing so, they risk being accused of acting white, of becoming a raceless self, of acting so much like white people that they've lost their humanity. So what do? Well, some try to disavow their blackness and just act as if they were a raceless person. Others might try to hide their achievement. So in school, they'll attend they'll attend lower sets and then secretly attend advanced classes at the weekends. But the point is that when you've got the two cultural schemas that come into conflict, a cultural schema of succeeding at blackness, as defined by family and friends, which says completely reject mainstream white society, and the schema of succeeding at schooling, which is enforced by that mainstream society and by school authorities. And when both of those cultural schemas have a really powerful grip on the subject, but are in tension with each other, black lives become shot through with tension. Their resistance implodes, Fordham writes, riddling their psyches with self-doubt. Students who went on to university from Capital High found that they were rejected by many of their peers for acting white. Going to university was said to be a white thing to do. And yet they felt they were never taken seriously by the white students at their new university who just ascribed their accomplishments to positive discrimination. They obviously couldn't have earned their place, it was said. So these kinds of predicaments, where whatever they did, they ended up being rejected, put incredible psychological pressure on students, which understandably often resulted in dysphoria, and a dysphoria marked by a deep sense of directionlessness and ambiguity of identity, concerns that don't necessarily stand out for people from other racial groups who might suffer from depression. So this case shows very clearly how the broader cultural pressures associated with success in the contemporary West can take on additional and particularly fraught meanings for a minority group still dealing with the legacy of centuries of persecution by the majority. But we'd never have fully understood that without Fordham having gone into the school, having lived with these kids, and seeing how deeply their conflicting ideas about reclaiming humanness featured in their lives. So that's one case. The second case I want to turn to comes from my own work in Indonesia. I've been working in the Riau Islands, just to the south of Singapore, for the past 14 years. And there, a slightly different set of problems can beset people who do well. So this area has long been imagined to be a complete backwater. It's tiny little islands on the edges of the state, not seen as a particularly vibrant or important place, seen as the kind of place that produces low-quality human resources. This is the phrase that is used in all of the public documents. And so the government of the province has tried staging large numbers of public contests to reassure people that they really are achievers and to motivate them to strive for ever greater things. So trophies, as you see in this slide, are handed out en masse. Many families have a trophy in their front room that their child or that they won for something. All kinds of things. It could be drawing or colouring or minibus driving or accounting or debating or PowerPoint presentations, all sorts of stuff. Now the problem is that the people who win these kinds of trophies, particularly the people who win them regularly, the people who succeed, struggle to believe that they really are as exceptional as they're told they are. And there are two reasons for that. Firstly, they think that politicians are just saying that they're high quality for their own purposes, to make it look like they're doing a good job with educational policy. And the fact that so many trophies are given out probably encourages that kind of suspicion. But secondly, and more interestingly, I think, most of the Indonesians that I knew didn't believe that talent was an individual capacity. There was none of this myth of the born genius that we sometimes hear over here in the UK. They thought that talent was grown. It was inculcated through the relationships that you had with your parents, with your religious leaders, with your school teachers, and so on, with the human resources that were around you. Talent was created by those relations. But the problem is that when you live in a backwater where everyone around you is a low-quality human resource, then your talent probably hasn't been created very well. And so what really does the trophy mean? Well, that fear, that distinctive understanding of the self, of having been grown by the people around you, had a couple of consequences for people's mental health. It meant that those who succeeded and who were sent off for special seminars in other locations, Jakarta, Singapore, were crippled with devastating levels of anxiety because they were convinced that they were frauds, imposters who'd won this trophy but whose inadequacy was immediately going to be found out. And for some, that proved incredibly debilitating. It also meant that although this was somewhere where everybody wanted to be a success, to become somebody was people's most often stated aspiration, there was less of a sense that they themselves were individually responsible for that. They saw it as being the state and wider society that was responsible, because that was what created them. And that, I think, had implications for the way in which their dysphoria was expressed. So sluggishness, a lack of motivation, tiredness, and so forth didn't stand out as particularly prominent symptoms of mental illness in the Riau Islands. Instead, the flashcard symptom was anger, deep sadness, deep anger, deep rage at the world. Anger at the society that had deprived them of the means of being the success that they so aspired to be. So once again, we see how particular local worlds, particular understandings of the self, particular historical circumstances, a historical circumstance of neglect and being a backwater, influence the ways in which people experience the most private and personal forms of suffering and pain. Now, whether or not any of these concerns were the issues that triggered Tennessee Williams's breakdown is something we can never know for certain. But personally, I think a clue to his own psychic anxieties comes from his fear that the people around him no longer related to him sincerely after he had become a success. Indeed, the way that he eventually cured his neurasthenia was by faking an eye operation. He said he had to go into hospital and his eye would be operated on. Maybe he would go blind. And then everyone was very concerned for him. Oh, we hope you don't go blind. And they started treating him kindly again. And he kind of felt he was back to normal. So it sounds melodramatic, and it is a little bit melodramatic. He wrote melodrama, we shouldn't be surprised. But it fits with a lot of comparative anthropological findings, which suggests that success and the forms of ranking and differentiation that it generates can often be very toxic to horizontal bonds of friendship. In many UK schools, for example, successful pupils can get bullied for their talents. In Kenya, high achievers are so afraid that they'll become victims of witchcraft that they hide or give away their school prizes. But again, that's not an inevitable response to success. There might be ways in which a successful person becomes a patron that ends up having to do homework for everyone else around them. That happens quite a lot in the Rio Islands as well. It reflects one particular social and cultural response to success and the pressures it can generate. And what I think we can see from all of these cases, if we stand back and try and draw some conclusions, is precisely that these different ideas of the ideal self, which exist in different parts of the world, and different ideas of how a self is generated, that have come about partly because of what we might call cultural difference, but often and usually because of particular historical, political, and economic factors that have generated that cultural difference, that have generated different ways of imagining the world, all carry their own distinct pressure points. So these pressure points determine what kinds of issues are particularly likely to trigger mental suffering. So there are some that are probably quite universal. Across the world, bereavement is a very common trigger for dysphoria, as we would expect. But what's interesting to see is that as there's an increasing emphasis on needing to do well in order to survive in the aggressive neoliberal economy, issues related to success and failure are increasingly becoming major triggers for how people relate to their own well-being. And those concerns also inflect the ways in which dysphoria is experienced and described. So can anthropology do anything to help in this kind of situation? Well, my answer here, regrettably, is yes and no. It's no in the sense that human beings, wherever they live, are always going to be at risk of dysphoria. We can't magic that away. But at the same time, we can do something. So when so many people are today consumed by feelings of inadequacy or worry about whether they're living up to their potential, fears and anxieties that can often feel incredibly private and incredibly shameful, one thing that anthropology can do is denaturalize them, allow us to get a little bit of critical distance towards some of our most dominant fears, to remind us that these feelings aren't necessarily as natural or as inevitable as they may seem, that they're responses to the social circumstances around us, understandable, legitimate responses, but there might be different ways of living in the world where they don't come to matter quite as much as we think they are. Secondly, we can reveal how situations that aim to help people, for example, by encouraging them to succeed, I believe in you, you can do it, can be inadvertently pressurizing. And we can start exploring ways in which we might be able to encourage healthier ways of relating to achievement, so that people are encouraged to pursue their goals, but don't feel like failures if they don't. And we can pay close attention to the ways in which these processes affect different groups in different ways. And that, I think, is particularly important because it can help us avoid the perpetuation of historic injustices, as we saw in the American case with the black kids in Capitol High, and it can avoid us producing new kinds of inequalities and hopefully allow all of us to inhabit our success-oriented world in a slightly more reflexive, happy, and successful way. So thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to find out more, you can't pick up a reading list from the front of the lecture hall because that is an error on my PowerPoint, but the reading list will be circulated by email. Please do send me an email if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask about the talk or just like to know more about anthropology in general. I'm always very happy to receive inquiries. It'd be great to correspond with you.